Well, welcome to Journey. My name is Jamie. I'm one of the pastors here. Did you guys have a nice Thanksgiving? Yeah. That's good. For those of you who didn't, just don't say anything. Thanks. We can talk about it later. But we were finishing up. We had a really short series this time around called Visitation. We're finishing it up because next week we kick off Advent, which is our anticipation of God coming and clothing himself in flesh and remembering the incarnation of Christ, what we call Christmas. So this is meant to be a little bit of a setup for that, because the Visitation series has been about God showing up in form in the Old Testament and interacting with people. The Old Testament is filled with pretty epic stories, and the Old Testament, like the New Testament, the Old Testament especially though, is written in a literary form. Each of the books has kind of their own, its own nuance. So, for instance, the Psalms are written a very specific way, and some of the early books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, they're written historically, but yet with literary themes. And so, I feel like one of my jobs is to come and try and communicate truth and try and share stories, but also to point out some of these beautiful literary elements so that some of the stories might have some new life to them. And so this has been reflecting back on the visitation of God taking form on the planet. We started with a conversation that God had with a man that he chose. It was just his choosing, and the man's name was Abraham, and he came and interacted with Abraham, actually showed up as three people showed up in the form of three beings, and said to Abraham, hey, I'm going to make you a father of a great nation. So I've chosen you, and I see you, and I'm going to use you. And through you, through your heritage, something beautiful is going to happen on the planet. Now, not only would this nation, the nation of Israel, become a great nation, would its peoples be blessed, but beyond what happens in the blessing of material wealth or success or nation status, you have, of course, beyond all that, the Messiah who would be born through this people, Jesus who would come to the planet and create a way for us to connect and align with God. We drop into this story with Abraham's grandchildren. So Abraham and Sarah give birth to a son named Isaac. Isaac marries a lady named Rebekah, and they get pregnant, and they're going to have children, and lo and behold, they're going to have twins. Now, I don't know what the moment was like for Isaac and Rebekah, but I also had a moment like this, almost in about, about 30 days, it'll be 23 years, that Angie and I, well, I didn't. Angie gave birth to twins, I just contributed. Angie gave birth to twins. But before that, Angie had a grandfather who was a twin, and her aunt had three sets of twins. This never came up, though, in dating. This was not part of the, hey, by the way, there was zero conversation about this. So when we walked down the aisle, I've told this story before, we walked down the aisle, I was 22, she was 21, we had no idea what we were doing. So we walked down the aisle, and she's like, let's have kids. I'm like, let's just practice. I don't. And so we were married for about 3 years, and she was always like, I want to have kids, I guess that's what you do. So, all right, let's have a kid. So, that was the extent of the thought and planning put into building our family. So, at 24, lo and behold, she says, well, I'm pregnant. And, okay, good, I guess we're going to have a kid. Again, I got to coach soccer. So, the day comes where you have the sonogram. Is that what it's called, sonogram thing? They put the juicy stuff on your stomach. And anyway, so the day comes, and I'm coming from soccer practice because I'm coaching at the time, and I come in with my video camera, and for you young people, the video camera wasn't like this, it was like this. So because you got a video, that's a thing, right? That's that moment. So I come in, I got the video camera, and the lady's, she's like, okay, everything looks good over on this side, everything looks good on that side, and I'm like, good. So the front and back of the kid are fine. And, she's like, yep, hold on. Wow. Well, it looks like there's two. I'm like, 2 legs, that's great. Does he also have 2 arms? She goes, No, there's two in there. You're going to have twins. I dropped the video camera. I'm not lying. Like, I dropped the video camera. To this day, we have the tape, but it's all black. You just hear the audio because I went, "What'd you say?" And all you hear when we played it back, all you hear is Angie's like, "Oh my gosh, we're going to have 2 children." Truthfully, on the video, you hear me going, "Dear God." I really do think the next thing I said was, "That's 2 kids going to college at the same time." So, needless to say, I wasn't really prepared. But I don't know what prepares you for kids anyway, right? I mean, those of you who've had kids, you just go into it. There's a lot of trust. Well, after the sonogram thing, we found out that they call it breech. They're breech, so they're not coming out the natural delivery system. So you have to come out head first, and if you're not head first, then they do a thing called a cesarean, and they cut you open. So the day came this was a couple days after Christmas. The day came, we'd set the date for the boys to be born. So and in those days, I don't know what it's like now. This is again almost 23 years ago. They put a little curtain over her, like on the middle of her body. So I'm with her head up here. Now she's in drugs, so she's in Happy Land. So I'm like, hey, and she's like, "Well, just fill me in on what you see." So I would just kind of look over the curtain every now and then. So she'd be like, "Well, just tell me what's happening." I'm like, "They have a razor blade on your stomach." Probably shouldn't say that. Everything looks great. And it's that moment where it's a little queasy, like, I might throw up. I don't know if I should look. I kind of want to look. I don't know if I should. Well, they finally got to the point where they're like, "Okay, here comes the first one." And I just watched the lady, vivid imagery, the lady taking her hands, plunging them into my wife's abdomen, and pulling 2 legs like this. And Jordan waving upside down, like, "Okay, there's the first kid." And put him in the tray. And then I look over. I mean, that's what they do. They put him in a tray. And then the second kid, that was Jordan. And then the next one, all I see, and I'm telling you, this is a little weird. Like if you've seen science fiction movies, the next thing I'm looking at my wife's abdomen and you just see a hand go like this. And then the head pops up and Tyler's like, "Freedom!" Pull him out. And I'm like, "Well, which one do I go to first?" Like, I got to snip the thing. And so I had no idea what I was doing. I don't know exactly what it was like for Isaac and Rebecca, but I do know this, because the Bible's very clear about their moment when she gives birth. Esau comes first. I assume it's a natural delivery system. But Jacob comes out grabbing Esau's heel. He's literally holding onto his foot, so it's like, whoa, here comes one, and there's the second one. Like, he's right out there with him, holding on. And so they were like, "Well, let's call the first kid Esau. What should we call the second kid? Let's call him Heel Grabber." That's what Jacob means. By the way, if your name is Jacob, sorry. Because Jacob lives out the meaning of his name. And this is part of this story that I want to tell you today, is that Jacob begins to live into his name. He lives into an identity. And we could have kind of a interesting sidebar conversation about how often we really do live into a name. Somebody calls us something, and we almost live into that reality, many of us. Because we all take a different path. Our ego, in the Bible uses terms like the flesh and things like that. The onset of the sciences, psychology in particular, has given us some other language, like the false self or the ego, which is essentially the container we live into. This is my ego. This is my identity on the planet, and it's helpful in the early days of life. It often preserves us. It protects us. The ego is where you get those primal feelings of fight, flight, or freeze. The ego is often driven by protection. It's often driven by a sense of fear, but it preserves us. However, it only does that for so long, because pretty soon we discover that the ego is only consumed with itself, and it does not truly have an awareness for others. Now, the ego may do things for others, but ultimately the motivation is self-preservation. Jesus' teachings and the teaching, all spirituality at some level is going after this. Jesus' teaching, of course, gets specific, and we believe leads us to this specific truth that we're meant to awaken to something beyond our ego. We're not just meant to keep refining the ego person in us. We're meant to awaken to an alternate reality. Jesus uses the term the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. There's another reality that's outside this reality, and it's God's way. It's the Jesus way. It's God's love. And there's different Greek terms for that kind of love. And the Greek term used for God's love is agape. That there is this deeper love that we're meant to awaken to. In the ego, we can't see it. So somehow we have to allow that ego part of us to die off so that we can awaken to who we really are in Christ. Before the foundations of the world, God knew us. He had created us in his image. In Latin, we use the term the imago Dei, meaning we're an expression of the divine. So he created us, we're God's expression, but the ego in our journey on the planet has closed us off to that. So Jesus used lots of words like we've become blind to it, we can't see. So the spiritual path is about awakening to our identity in Christ. This is a story about a man named Jacob who is a deceiver and a manipulator, who's a liar, who's totally into self-preservation, and he lives like this with this internal conflict for a long time in his life. He has two interesting encounters with God, and we're going to read about both of them, how they impacted his life, and how I believe universally it gives us a picture of how we're meant to interact with God and how he is meant to impact our lives. Let me give you a little bit of backdrop before we get to Jacob's first divine encounter. Esau, the firstborn, becomes, he's daddy's boy. He's the hunter, he's the masculine guy. He's actually really hairy. The Bible kind of makes it, that's a thing. So, and he's the musky, hairy, masculine, I'm going to go kill my food, go kill. So this is Esau, and dad loves him, and he's dad's favorite. Jacob becomes mama's boy. He's a chef. He's super creative, and they kind of create this almost personification of the two personalities. They really are this drastically different kind of person. Well, in this culture, if you're the firstborn, which is interesting, I mean, firstborn by what? Like a split second? But Esau's still the firstborn, so he has the birthright and he has the blessing. And in that culture, that's a big deal. Not only is it full of honor, but you're given the double portion of an inheritance. There are lots of things that come with being the firstborn. Jacob knows this, and he sees an opportunity possibly to steal his brother's birthright. His brother comes home from hunting one day. He's famished. He doesn't kill anything. And in a moment of weakness, Jacob manipulates him into selling him his birthright. Not long after that, in cahoots with his mother, Jacob comes up with another plan, and they wind up deceiving his father to gain the blessing. He winds up stealing both the birthright and the blessing from his brother Esau, and his brother, of course, once he realizes this, becomes so enraged that he's ready to put an arrow through Jacob's heart. Well, Jacob realizes this, and again with his mother, decides it might be a good idea for me to leave town because I'm going to die. My brothers are going to kill me. It doesn't matter that I have this birthright. I might be dead soon. So they make a plan, and Jacob is going to take off to go be with his uncle Laban. But he's on his own. And so there's this beginning picture of kind of the hero's journey. Those of you around for the Storyteller series, I talked a little bit about the elements of story. This becomes kind of this thematic element. Off goes Jacob on his own to another foreign land. Now, I mean, he's mama's boy. He's used to living indoors. Everything was pretty cozy. Now he has to go do kind of this trek on his own, and off he goes. And you can tell he's scared. He's nervous. He's got to go try and find this brother. He's going to hopefully go start another life in another place. Along the way, he has an encounter with God. Genesis 22, verses 10 through 22. Jacob left Beersheba home and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Now, this is a pretty epic story. It's made its way into culture. People have made paintings on this. Huey Lewis did a song about this. Like, Jacob's Ladder's a thing. Like, people have talked about it all throughout history. This is a pretty powerful story that's made its way. It's really picture more like a ziggurat, like a Mesopotamian stairway is a better picture of what this is. But it's this imagery that angels are ascending and descending. It's almost like this science fiction gateway into the other world. Jesus references the same thing. In the New Testament, Jesus is having a conversation with Nathanael, one of his followers, and he actually references this ascending and descending, that there's this gateway. Now, of course, there are gateways that show up sacred spaces, and you're going to see how Jacob reacts to this. In the Old Testament, you have these kind of sacred spaces. This well is a sacred place. This mountain is a sacred place. This hill is a sacred place. This set of stones, this altar is a sacred place. That's thematic, by the way. Shows up all the way into the New Testament where you have this veil that's set inside the temple that's supposed to separate man from God. The place where God rests is called the Holy of Holies. And when Jesus dies, all this sacred physical space stuff, all the way to the veil, metaphorically, comes to an end. The veil splits in half from top to bottom. The sacred space is now not a hilltop. It's not a mountain somewhere. The sacred space is here. You and I are the containers of the sacred. When Jesus said, I send the Comforter, called by my name, placed inside you. You're meant to, when you align in Christ, you're the sacred space. If someone wants to go to some place to interact with God, all they have to do is interact with you, aligned with Christ. It's just a beautiful literary thematic thing that shows up all the way through the story of the Bible. So there's this moment. Jacob is having this dream, this vision. There at the top of this staircase is the Lord. And he has a word for Jacob. I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Wow. Imagine this moment. The God of the universe, who holds the stars in his hand, is saying, I see you. And I'm going to pour out the abundance of everything at my fingertips onto you and your heritage, your family, the people who will be born through you. The entire world will be blessed through you. What's Jacob's response? This is interesting, by the way. Who does he come to tell this to? This really holy man who's been fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, who's been giving to the poor, who's really good at his Bible study. No, he gives it to a liar and a cheat and a deceiver who's running for his life because he just swindled his brother. What does this tell us about grace? The promise is not based on the behavior of Jacob. The promise is based on the character of God. So important for us to recognize this. And important for us to see how Jacob interacts with God, because it's how most of us do. Jacob awakens from his sleep and thought, whoa, surely the Lord was in this place and I didn't see it. Important thing about spirituality, by the way. Spiritual truths are often in plain sight and we don't see them. I'll come back to that. But he was afraid. He said, well, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. I mean, he's clearly had a moment with the divine. He recognizes, but he's not totally sure what to do with it. God's given him a preview. Jacob, from this point on, will have a sense of destiny, but it's super cloudy. Early in the morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head, set it up as a pillar, poured oil on top of it, just kind of a way of memorializing the place. And he called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow. So God speaks to him, offers him a promise of abundance, and really, and the entire world will be blessed through you. Jacob, hey, last night, that whole thing I'm going to say something back to you. And listen to the if-then statement stuck in this. Listen to the transaction, and listen to how we often take the abundance of God and shrink it down to something manageable. I mean, he's just like us. Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and watch over me on the journey, because I'm not used to going alone, this journey I'm taking, if he'll watch over me and he'll give me some food to eat, if Chick-fil-A's open, he'll give me some clothes, a good H&M card, gift card, so I can pick out what I want to wear, and then I can return safely to my Father's household, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone that I have set up as a pillar, then we'll make it his house. And of all that you give me, I'll even give you a little kickback, 10%. Sound good? That's my vow. Taps his stone and all on his way. Like how many of us, like this is our little God. God is offering us the universe full of love. And we're like, yeah, I'm not really ready for all that. But if you could just give me some clothes and a good car, I'd like a job. He negotiates. And I think part of it is because he doesn't, like he sees God as like the best version of himself. Maybe. He says like, well, I wouldn't give me everything, but maybe some clothes. Think about how we often pray the same way. What happens? Jacob's not yet prepared. He doesn't yet trust God. God has made him an unconditional offer. He counters with a business transaction. God knows that we can only handle so much at one time. This isn't news to God, by the way. He's not like, oh, that totally went wrong. Maybe I'll go back to Esau. Like, God's fully aware of what's happening. And God goes, I'm blessing you whether you are aware of it or not, whether you see it or not, whether you can grasp it or not, I'm blessing you. Because this is what I do, because it's who I am. I am love. Not occasionally, I'm done with my wrath and I get around to loving you. I am love. Am love. And so it's an invitation every second of every day. It seems that there's a universal truth wedged into this story. What we can handle is in direct correlation to how empty we are of ourselves and how filled we are with his Spirit. Remember I said there are spiritual secrets in plain view? Have you ever read Sherlock Holmes or watched any of the movies or anything? So what's the thing about Sherlock Holmes that's so amazing? Is it that he has some magical ability? No, it's not magical. What happens? It's two people of interaction and one person lacks the powers of observation. Sherlock walks up and goes, well, I see that on your cuff, and based on your dialect, and based on the way your shoe is worn, and this thing on your lapel, that tells me this, 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 and this. The other person's like, how did you know that? I just looked. God's truths are like that. They swirl around us. Do you know part of the reason we gather on Sunday is to fine-tune our observation skills? This is one of the reasons we get together. To sing our prayers into songs, to gather around the Word, to listen to teaching, to interact with one another. It's to raise our level of discernment so that as we are doing life, as Timmons calls it, those 10,000 minutes of the week, to go, as I'm living out life, that I'm tuned in more. I see what I didn't see before. This is one of the spiritual practices we do so that we can see. So what happens? Jacob just receives a preview because he could only handle a preview. We'll finish with the story because there's another interaction with God. But before we get to that, I'll fill in this part of the story. What happens? Jacob finally makes it to Haran, and the player gets played. He meets his Uncle Laban, but he's got a contender because Uncle Laban is such a deceiver and manipulator too. So the two of them spend most of the next 14, 15, beyond 20 years just sparring in their manipulation with one another. It starts like this. Jacob gets there, and one of the first people he meets is this lady named Rachel. And he's smitten. He falls in love. And he finds out that Laban is, in fact, her father, and so that's part of how they interact. He's like, oh, my mother sent me here. I'm supposed to come here. Can you take me in? I want to live my life. And by the way, I'd like to marry your daughter. And Laban says, well, that's great, but in our culture, in order to do that, you have to work for me for 7 years. Jacob goes, no problem. I'd love to. And the Bible says, the Bible actually fits this little part in, which I think is fun. It says, Jacob worked for 7 years, and it was as if it was one day. What love will do to us. So the 7 years are up. The wedding ceremony takes place. It's lovely. They have a wonderful night. In that culture, the bride would cover her face all the way through the night, and there would be a lovely moment of consummation that evening, perhaps a little awkward, but you have the consummation. And the next morning, it's here we go. Let's start our life. One problem. Jacob wakes up and after having a lovely evening, and the veil is now not on the face, and the sun is up, and he goes, you're not Rachel. Laban, he runs out and he says to Laban, that's Rachel's older sister, Leah. Laban goes, yeah, we got another thing in our culture I forgot to tell you about. If you want to marry Rachel, you got to marry the oldest girl first. So you did. So now I can marry Rachel? Yes. Okay, I'll have 2 wives. For another 7 years of work. Okay. So another 7 years. And finally gets to marry Rachel. And that creates a little bit of drama, as you might imagine. Being married to one person can be a little challenging. Being married to 2 adds a whole other flavor. There's some tension in the home. You throw in a few concubines and 12 kids later, and you have the 12 tribes of Israel. I'm accelerating through the story some. It's a lot of drama. They start to have kids. I don't think they've had Benjamin yet. So I think it's 11 kids are born between the wives and their handmaidens, and again, lots of drama. And Jacob essentially begins to kind of build a family and gain wealth. He gains wealth through a very unusual mating method of sheep and goats. And if you're just really into that, just go, you can read the story. It's interesting. But it's part of the conniving. Laban's trying to play him. He's playing Laban. And he really does. There's a moment where he really turns the tables on Laban, and he's become quite wealthy. Well, he's overstayed his welcome. It's time to leave. So now he's got a big family. He's got some wealth. He's got his life. He's going to maybe head back home. So picture this massive caravan. All the servants, all the sheep, all the goats, the herdsmen. Everybody's moving. Well, word comes to him. Hey, guess who's coming this way? Remember that chapter in your life a long time ago? Your brother. He's coming with 400 other people, which seemed to be a contingent of like a group of men ready for battle. Jacob's terrified. So what does Jacob do? He remembers the blessing of God. He falls on his knees. He begins to pray. No. Jacob immediately does what Jacob does. He goes, well, let's work out a little theatrical production. Let's cut everything in 2. So we're going to have 2 different groups. So if he kills off one, I still got a second one in backup. Or I can give him like a whole lot of stuff. Maybe that will appease him. And we'll use some like different language. Like I'll call him Lord. I'll bow down to him. Like whatever it takes for him not to kill me. And he works up this whole plan. The night before this happens, he goes to be by himself and reflect upon the following day when his twin brother, whom he hasn't seen his years, is going to come. He's going to come face to face with him. What will happen? Will he be dead? Will he be alive? He has no idea. And we'll pick up the story right there. Genesis chapter 32. That night, Jacob got up, took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone. And while he's alone, a man shows up. This is from Jacob's point of view. So he sees a man. A man shows up and begins wrestling with him, and wrestles with him all through the night up until daybreak. And when the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that the hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. So the wrestling, there's this moment where this other being just touches him, and suddenly he's in all this pain. But he refuses to let go. And so the man says, let me go, for it is daybreak. And Jacob replies, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Now something has happened between those 2 lines. There's something dramatic that has happened within Jacob. We'll come back to that. Something dramatic. This is the moment. This is the turn in the story. The whole turn happens in this moment. In the middle of the wrestling match, his hip is dislocated, and he holds on to him and says, I won't let you go until you bless me. This is the whole turn of the story. It's right there in that space. The man asked him, what is your name? Conniver, heel grabber, deceiver, liar. My name's Jacob. The man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have come out alive, have overcome. Jacob is wrestling with God. He's wrestling with the divine being. Perhaps it's the second person of the Trinity, at least for our mind to kind of put a hook on this, because it's very difficult for us to really understand how God is displaying himself through form anyway. But it seems to be as Jacob goes through this process, we really get to picture that this is the Christ. And that Jacob is wrestling with him, and there is this immediate recognition that this is this struggling between the false self and the true self, between the ego and Christ. And here it is on this mountain wrestling together. Something that Jacob is doing, has been doing his whole life. The metaphor and the abstract picture of what's going on internally in Jacob all through his life seems to suddenly become literal. Here he is actually wrestling, physically wrestling with what he's been wrestling with his whole life. Will I continue to strive, manipulate, and deceive my way through the world to get what I want? Or will I surrender to the divine? The thing about the ego is unwilling to allow the imago Dei to shine. It's designed for self-preservation and lives by fear. Thomas More says this: the true self is not something to be fabricated by achievement, cleverness, training, or learning. It is not the product of self-analysis or understanding. It is a gift. It's who you are before the foundations of the earth, waiting to be accepted and then nurtured in its unfolding expression. This is a pretty good way to check in. Am I living alive to Christ, abiding in the vine, or am I lost in my flesh, caving to my ego? A pretty good check-in is, am I obsessed with achieving? Am I obsessed with training, learning? Are these things bad? Are these things wrong? No, they're not. But it's the energy involved. Am I finding my confidence in my ability to understand? Then I'll trust. Once I figure this out, then I'll trust. God will make a vow. If you'll do this, then I'll trust you. I know you've offered me the whole world, but I only want a little bit until I'm ready. The ego's always attempting to manage God. But the check-in is to go, or am I simply accepting the goodness in my life as a gift that's meant to be accepted and nurtured? Do you know how hard it is just to accept that you're loved? Like, what was it like yesterday when you felt that feeling of shame? And what was it like 2 days ago when you felt rejected? And what was it like 3 days ago when you got tweaked about whatever else? When even your true self, you go, wait, Mom, just accept that I'm loved. Doesn't matter what he said or she said or I'm saying in this other voice. And not only am I accepting it, I'm going to nurture that and watch the unfolding expression of who I am in Christ. It doesn't mean there isn't doing. There's doing involved, but it's from, where does the energy come from? It seems that for God to expand our potential and fine-tune our alignment, he has to break the place in us where we are most self-confident. And that really sucks. Because we like being self-confident. Like, we like going, I'm really good at this. But at the moment we think we originated that thing we're good at, and is not a gift, is the moment we are trusting in our ego. It's not accidental that the thigh was dislocated. What does the thigh represent? It's the pillar of man's strength. Ask any woman who's a dancer, ask any man, ask any athlete, ask your thighs and your core, all of your strength emanates from that place. It all begins there. If your thigh bone is out, you've been disabled, and there's one thing for sure, you will be unable to stand alone. If your thigh bone is out, something is going to have to prop you up, or someone. And that's actually the design. I know we love to be independent. Hi, I'm Jamie. I love to be independent. If you've been grown up in this country at some level, you've gotten the message of the American rugged individualism. There's something that sounds really cool about being independent on our own, and yet that's a design flaw. We were created to be in community. We were created in relationship for relationship. We were created in love, by love, for love. One of the ways we experience that is in relationship with one another, the sacred space on the planet. It's one of the places we interact with God. You go, yeah, but the other person's got an ego too. That's right, so you better have eyes to see the spiritual truths plainly in front of you. If you look at another person and all you see is their ego, it's just because you haven't awakened. Can you let the veil be ripped from top to bottom of every human being you interact with and go, oh, there's Christ. There's beauty. There's love. There's the most sacred space on the planet right there. Curtain comes back. Whoa, there's the ego again. Yeah, but give me eyes to see, ears to hear the sacred space in front of me. Our trouble with other humans is not who we are in Christ. Our trouble is our ego gets tweaked by something. Jacob is putting all this together. This is like if this was a film and you were watching this moment, the camera would cut in close to Jacob's face and you would see the nuances, the twitching of his eyes, the curling of his lips as you look at him and go, he's recognizing something. This man is awakening to a much deeper truth. He's beginning to understand. His name is changing. It's not that he will ever totally forget Jacob, and he's going to have lots of Jacob moments still in his life. But the identity at this moment is shifting. He's recognizing that there's something new. And the name shifts from deviousness to openness, from Jacob to Israel. I now live in an open posture, not a closed one. I have been utterly lonely. That's really what's beneath it all, by the way. Ultimately, while we're in self-preservation, we're just deeply lonely. Most of us aren't going to understand that because it's so many layers deep. You're like, what's your feeling? I don't know what my feeling is. Okay, well, if you could get around to a feeling, what could it be? Fear. I feel fear a lot. Okay, but get underneath that. I can't feel anything. Just try. If you drill down long enough, what you're going to discover is we were all created for another kind of being, another dimension. We call it the Garden of Eden. We're created in an Edenic state to be an ever-present love exchange with God. So all of us have at some place a loneliness that just aches to be in that perfect place with God. We either open ourselves to it and see it, or we medicate, we get distracted. Jacob clings to the divine, believing that he could be made new. See, this is what he realizes. If God has the power to disable and the power to destroy and the power to break something in me, he clings, he holds on. He says, I'm not letting you go until you bless me. Because if you have the power to do that with a touch, then that same being must also have the power to heal and give life. I wonder if for a long time you've been living in a narrative in your life, that thing that broke in you, that place where you were crushed, and you even had questions about the goodness of God. You said, I don't understand, mind, ego, why God would do that. And it was actually the greatest gift of your life. Because God was saying, I'm not going to leave you in that false self forever. I had to crush the place where you were most self-confident so you would find me. I've created you for love. You're living a life of self-confidence and false control and missing out on The preview that I gave you all those years ago. Come to the abundance. The invitation is not stopped. And when I came to you, you didn't know. And you may have trouble knowing now. But behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man opens the door, I will come in, break bread. We'll be in alignment. And the oneness that you long for will be true. By the way, that's called salvation. Have you ever heard somebody say, man, have you ever been saved? Or somebody ever says to you, what does it mean to be saved? You just say this. Somewhere along the way, I gave up on me and I put my faith in him. That's salvation. And there's a moment where we awaken to it, but it's a series of moments. The Bible actually talks about the working out of our salvation. It continues. The theological term for this is sanctification. We're continually going through the process of recognizing who we are. What happens? This second person of the Trinity, the Christ, he changes Jacob's name. The healer heals. He leaves a scar. He leaves a reminder. But he heals him. And so the bearer of the promise, Israel, the father of the chosen nation, the leader of leaders, would now lead with a limp. His brokenness would be his reminder that self-reliance leads to emptiness. You can never fill it. But that humility leads to life. Do you see who it is that the Father chooses? Usually, in all the stories, it's the last one you would expect. The dastardly who becomes humble, and the humble who remain so. Would you pray with me? Can we have a moment for reflection? Would you just close your eyes, bow your heads, stare at the floor, whatever helps you focus. I just want to create a little space before we sing. And our worship here they're just prayers set to melodies, and they're just songs that are full of reflection. And through the gift of art, those songs help us connect with our hearts. That's what music and worship in a church context is really meant to be. We take prayers, we set them to music to help us get out of our heads a little bit and feel something. But before we go to the music, would there be an Israel moment, an openness? Just let God speak to you. Is there a self-confidence thing that you've been holding on to, gripping, so that you could survive or succeed or achieve? And what would it look like for the confidence to remain, but for it to be in God? And how might that subtly shift your state of being? Would you just have a conversation with God about his abundance, about his love? If you've got questions, if you're still angry, if you still don't get it, if you're overwhelmed, whatever you're feeling, speak it out, confess it, offer it to the great heavenly Father of all. He's ever present. You belong in that presence. And if you have no words, then just sit and listen. God, I think I close myself off the most when I'm trying to protect myself from myself. I think when I fear being rejected or have feelings of shame, I try to work harder, I strive more intensely, I feel greater anxiety, more pressure. And rather than opening myself up to the abundance of your love and grace, I think I close down into some kind of performance or negotiation. I certainly saw that last night as I was reading this story. God, you've heard my confession, I've received your forgiveness, but I just feel it in me. I feel that Jacob part of me, and my request is to open me to grace and expand my awareness of love, and let it start with self-compassion, with that compassion then flow to others. And I pray for my brothers and sisters in the room, however it manifests for them, whatever the nuance is, the subtlety, the shifting to fear, leaving love. Spirit, would you permeate the sacred space? Not the air and not the walls, but us. Here we are. Somehow we're your body now. I don't get that. It seems like a deep mystery to me. But we're your body represented walking around on this planet, and we're the light of the world. Would we let that light shine inward first so that we would experience love? And then would it just emanate from us? Heighten our senses. Can we see the sacredness in those around us? Here are maybe at times our feeble attempt at words, but here's a few of our prayers that we put into songs that we want to give back to you and sing out to you as a source of or expression of worship. Sing out our gratitude and our petition. In the name of Christ.